They waited for Fred in a small conference room. Carpeted, a table, no windows. He recognized the Frenchman immediately, who was remarkably close in appearance to the man he had pictured over the phone. He took Fred by the shoulders and kissed his cheeks and whispered something in his own language. The lawyer shook his hand. She was an elegant, severe woman, headmistress or someone who trained horses, and here she was called a barrister. She introduced him to the defendant. The defendant spoke with a German accent, and there was a yellow hard hat resting on his lap. People like to throw things once in a while, he explained, shaking hands. He was a big man with a large belly and a smooth pink face, thinning hair. A square white bandage was taped to the crown of his head, and he peeled it half back to reveal a patch of discolored flesh. Stitches. I hope no one throws anything at you. Me too, Fred said. Why would they? He took a pack of Chesterfields from inside his jacket, and the barrister asked him politely not to smoke. Fred complied. He believed in the innate goodness of women. Her client asked him if he believed in UFOs. Fred asked him to repeat himself. He looked at the barrister, who did not look back. Flying saucers, Fred said. Well, he said, flying saucers. Can't say I've seen one myself, but I guess anything's possible. What if I told you, the defendant said, that what we think of as UFOs are in reality highly advanced Nazi aircraft, designed and built near the end of the war but still operational today, flying reconnaissance missions out of secret bases in the Antarctic? Well, Fred said. He cleared his throat and spoke carefully. I guess you could call me a show-me kind of guy. Then I show you. The German took a fat old briefcase out from under the table. He opened it, lifted a sheaf of paperwork, and fanned it carefully out before Fred. Articles, photographs, and drawings of Nazi UFO prototypes. Something that looked like a sombrero with an iron cross on the bell. An official UFO investigator's kit, complete with a pass, spotting chart, a list of questions to ask the crew upon landing, a scale model for only $4.50 plus postage, a proposed expedition to Antarctica to find the South Polar opening, leaving from Buenos Aires in a chartered jumbo jet. Cost of reservations, $9,999. I'm in the mail order business, the defendant explained. People buy this? I can't keep up. And you believe it? As you say, the defendant said, anything is possible. Until proven otherwise, the barrister said. You would like hard evidence, the German said. Documentation. More pictures, perhaps. I'd like a cigarette, Fred said. Evidence of what exactly? The barrister had a manila folder, a stack of 8 by 10 photographs. She laid them on top of the pile before him. Old, black and white, aerial reconnaissance, some sort of compound, a camp. I don't see any flying saucers, Fred said. Do you see any gas chambers? The Frenchman said. You consider yourself a skeptic? The defendant asked. You could say I'm on the pragmatic side, Fred said. His glasses needed cleaning. So, what do you think of the 6 million? The 6 million. And go to Golozum, the barrister said with a fair accent. The camps, the gas, the hollow cause. The Holocaust industry, the German said. Industry, Fred said. You name it, the barrister said. Reparations for one, the defendant said. 5,000 Deutschmarks per Jew. You do the math. Not to mention free real estate, a homeland for Israel and half of Europe to the communists. Not to mention entertainment, books, plays, movies, operas, all of it propaganda. Surely you've heard of the Diary of Anne Frank? A fraud, the Frenchman said, written in ballpoint ink. Ballpoint did not come into use until the 50s. I wasn't aware, Fred said. But you believe, the defendant said. You accept the official story. I believe what I was taught, I suppose. Never had reason not to. But the numbers, the barrister said. The 6 million. Fred looked at her. 6 million is quite a figure. But you've never really thought about it, the defendant said. You can smoke in the hall if you like, the barrister said. Then we'll talk numbers. So they started with the numbers. Arithmetic. Between 3 and 4 million fled Europe between 1933 and 1945. Less than 3.5 million remaining in occupied territory. Documented. Not even Einstein could get 6 out of 3.5. By the end of the war, less than 400,000 inmates had been registered to Auschwitz, a synthetic coal and rubber plant. Gutta percha, the Frenchman said. Why would you slaughter your own labor force, the defendants said. Why would you strain your resources shuffling millions of refugees about Europe in the midst of such desperate military and economic straits, fighting a full-scale war on multiple fronts? It defies logic, and no more logical people have ever lived. He said something else, in German, the sound of logic. From numbers, they moved on to names, not just the big ones, the headliners, but the supporting cast as well. Heydrich, Haas, Gerstein, Rassignier, the former inmate who debunked claims of gassing at Buchenwald. Fanslau, the SS Major General who took a personal interest in the welfare of labor camp prisoners, who once had a guard shot on the spot for slapping a pregnant inmate. Hundreds of letters written on his behalf by former inmates, photocopies on file, never admitted as evidence at Nuremberg, just as cross-examinations by defense attorneys were not permitted. So-called confessions of former SS officers, extracted by beatings and torture, medical records on file. The so-called memoirs of Haas and Eichmann, communist Jewish fabrications, fictions of human soap and handbags made of skin, doctored photographs, burned corpses from Hamburg and Dresden, the real Holocausts, superimposed on concentration camp negatives, accounts of Einsatzgruppen and Sonderkommando, but no surviving eyewitnesses, no documentation, and never a single written order to harm a single hair on a single Jewish head. The Madagascar Plan, superseded at the Wannsee Conference by the final solution, not extermination, but Arbeitsansatz im Osten, labor assignment in the East. It was on file. The only gas you will ever find in the so-called death camps, the defendants said, and he imitated a fart. Fred felt a fine spray. No facilities ever found at Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. So all eyes turned to the east, to Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor. Nothing could be disproved because the Soviets did not allow inspections for 10 years, till they'd had time to make alterations, when they needed to make a case for something worse than themselves, as if anything could be worse than Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, the North Koreans, their countless millions of corpses. Of course they were starved to skeletons. Saturation bombing by the Allies had destroyed German supply lines. Of course there were mountains of bodies and burning pits. Typhus outbreaks were rampant near war's end, and all the doctors needed at the Russian front. But the bulldozers were British, also on file. The smell of burning rubber has been compared to that of burning flesh, the defendant said. Gutta percha, the Frenchman said. The Red Cross was permitted full access, the barrister said. Not a trace of mistreatment reported, let alone genocide. They even forced the Nazis to install new plumbing in the showers. There was an inmate swimming pool, 9,000 parcels a day received by prisoners. There are copious memoranda. The Frenchman said, We're not saying this was paradise, but no worse than the American internment camps for the Japanese, the German said. We were at war with the Japanese, Fred said, and thought of his father. The defendant stifled a belch. In 1936, the Zionist leader Weizmann declared war on Germany on behalf of the world's Jewry. Actually, that needs looking into, the Frenchman said. What can you prove? Fred asked. We don't have to prove everything, the barrister said, but where there's smoke, there's reasonable doubt. You don't have to believe us, the Frenchman said. Perhaps better you don't, the defendant said. Ideally, it's better you don't believe a thing. Then of what use am I? Fred said. Everyone looked at everyone else. There has never been a definitive forensic examination of the camps, the barrister said, especially of the facilities in question. Someone familiar with the various modes of execution would be required, particularly gas chambers, and who knew such an expert even existed? Fred wanted another cigarette. You will go as an officer of the court, she said. Go where? Fred said, and they looked at him. I have this thing about planes, he said. You have the fear of flying, the Frenchman said. I have the fear of crashing, Fred said. Then I will row you there myself, the defendant said. As an officer of the court, you will find what you will find. I will accept it. The proof, as they say, is in the pudding. What exactly are you accused of? Fred asked. I'm in the mail order business, the defendant said, and emptied his briefcase out on the table.